The ocean has always been a graveyard of secrets, a vast, churning expanse that hides the bones of empires beneath its restless tides. But there is one story, etched in the salt and blood of history, that stands above the rest. A tale of iron, ambition, and the terrifying shadow of a power that should have remained buried. It was a day when the horizon didn't meet the sky, but instead met a wall of fire and timber. A day when the screams of thousands were drowned out by the roar of cannons and the unnatural shrieks of creatures that belonged in nightmares, not on the open sea. This was the turning point. This was the moment the world held its breath and watched the waves turn crimson. Welcome back to Chronicle Nexus, where today we are diving deep into the foam and the fury of the legendary Chronicles of Bone, the Battle of the Bay. To understand the magnitude of what transpired at the Bay, one must first understand the precarious state of the world leading up to that fateful morning. The geopolitical landscape was a tattered tapestry, held together by fraying threads of ancient treaties and mutual distrust. For decades, the coastal territories had enjoyed a fragile peace, a golden age of trade and discovery. The bay itself was the crown jewel of this era, a sprawling, deep-water port that served as the beating heart of commerce for the southern realms. It was a place where gold flowed as freely as the tide, where silks from the east met the raw ores of the north. But where there is prosperity, there is always envy, and where there is power, there is always a predator waiting in the darkness. The rumors began as whispers in the taverns of the low docks, talk of ghost ships with sails the color of dried blood, and a rising tide of skeletal remains washing up on the outer reefs. At first, the authorities dismissed these as the ramblings of drunken sailors or the superstitions of those who had spent too much time under the scorching sun. But the whispers soon turned into chilling reports of entire fishing villages vanishing overnight, leaving behind nothing but scorched sand and a lingering scent of ozone. A new force was rising from the depths of the Bone Archipelago, led by a figure whose name had become a curse: Malachor the Unyielding. Malachor was not merely a warlord, he was a catalyst for chaos. He sought to reclaim what he believed was his ancestral birthright, the control of the sea lanes and the total subjugation of the coastal cities. But Malachor possessed something far more dangerous than just a fleet of warships. He had unearthed the core of the abyss, an ancient relic mentioned only in the most forbidden scrolls of the Bone Chronicles. This relic allowed him to command not just men, but the very essence of the ocean's darker side. He didn't just sail the waves, he bent them to his will. As the shadow of Malachor's fleet grew longer, the Council of the Free Cities finally realized the gravity of the threat. They knew that if the bay fell, the entire continent would be strangled, every trade route would be severed, and the wealth of nations would be funneled into Malachor's dark crusade. The call to arms was sent out, echoing across the valleys and over the peaks. An uneasy alliance was forged between the merchant lords, the exiled knights of the Silver Coast, and the enigmatic mages of the High Spire. This was the birth of the Coalition Fleet, a desperate gathering of every ship that could float and every man who could hold a blade. The atmosphere in the days leading up to the battle was suffocating. The air was heavy with the scent of impending rain and the metallic tang of sharpening steel. In the harbor of the bay, thousands of soldiers and sailors worked tirelessly, reinforcing hulls with iron plating and mounting experimental ballistae on the decks of the heavy galleons. There was a sense of grim determination, but beneath it, a primal fear. They weren't just preparing for a naval engagement. They were preparing for an encounter with the supernatural. On the eve of the conflict, the great lighthouse of the bay, a structure that had stood for 6 centuries as a beacon of safety, was extinguished. It wasn't blown out by the wind. It was extinguished by a sudden, unnatural fog that rolled in from the horizon, thick as wool and cold as the grave. It was a signal. The enemy was here. As the sun began to peek over the eastern cliffs on the morning of the battle, the fog began to lift, revealing a sight that shattered the morale of even the most seasoned veterans. Stretched across the mouth of the bay was a fleet of hundreds, their hulls dark and jagged, looking more like obsidian shards than wooden ships. At the center sat Malicor's flagship, the ossuary, a monstrosity of black timber and bone-white sails that seemed to pulse with a sickly violet light. The water around his ships didn't ripple, it boiled. The coalition fleet, led by Admiral Valerius on the flagship Vanguard of Hope, moved into a defensive crescent formation. Valerius was a man of iron will, a veteran of 100 skirmishes, but even he felt a chill as he looked through his spyglass. He saw figures on the decks of the enemy ships that were not human, hunched, pale creatures with elongated limbs and eyes that burned with a cold blue fire. These were the bone-bound, the reanimated husks of fallen sailors, bound to Malicor's service by the power of the core. The silence that preceded the first shot was deafening. It was that pregnant pause where history hangs in the balance. Then the silence was shattered. Malicor didn't start with a cannonade, he started with a ritual. From the deck of the ossuary, a pillar of violet light erupted into the sky, tearing through the clouds. The sea groaned, and suddenly, massive tentacles of water, hardened like glass, rose from the depths and slammed into the lead ships of the coalition. Wood splintered like matchsticks. Screams filled the air as men were tossed into the churning waters, only to be dragged down by unseen hands. This was the grasp of the deep, the first of many horrors Malicor would unleash. Admiral Valerius, realizing that traditional tactics would fail against such sorcery, gave the order that would define the opening phase of the battle. Full sail, break their line, or die in the attempt. The Battle of the Bay had begun in earnest. It was no longer a chess match of maneuvers. It was a brutal, chaotic brawl on a titanic scale. The coalition ships charged forward, their cannons roaring in a rhythmic defiance against the magical onslaught. The sky turned gray with the smoke of black powder, and the surface of the bay became a labyrinth of floating wreckage and burning oil. As the two fleets collided, the sound was like the world itself was breaking apart. The grinding of hull against hull, the rhythmic beat of the war drums, and the clashing of steel created a symphony of destruction. But as the first boarding parties leaped across the gaps and the bone-bound began to swarm the coalition decks, it became clear that this was not just a battle for territory. This was a battle for the very soul of the sea. Malicor's plan was unfolding with a terrifying precision, and the defenders of the bay were about to realize that the nightmare was only just beginning. Stay with us here at Chronicle Nexus as we peel back the layers of this epic confrontation, exploring the heroes who rose, the traitors who fell, and the ancient power that threatened to drown the world in a tide of bone. To understand the sheer scale of the horror that unfolded in the heart of the bay, one must first understand the twisted engineering of Malicor's fleet. These were not ships in the traditional sense. They were not carved from oak or forged in the shipyards of men. The Bone Fleet was a macabre resurrection of every vessel that had ever succumbed to the bay's treacherous reefs over 1,000 years. Malicor, using the forbidden rites of the marrow, had fused these shipwrecks together with calcified remains and necrotic energy. When the first line of the coalition's galleons engaged, their cannons fired true, but the iron balls simply thudded into the porous, skeletal hulls of the enemy. absorbed by layers of magically reinforced bone that seemed to knit itself back together in seconds. At the center of this naval nightmare was Admiral Kalen Valerius, the commander of the Azure Guard. Valerius was a man of logic and cold steel, a veteran of a dozen conventional wars, who believed that every enemy had a breaking point. But as he stood on the quarterdeck of the Pride of Ethelgard, watching his flagship's broadsides do nothing but chip away at the edges of a monster, that logic began to fracture. He saw his men, seasoned sailors who had faced hurricanes without blinking, shaking as they looked through their spyglasses. They weren't just looking at ships. They were looking at a floating graveyard that screamed with the voices of 1,000 drowned souls every time the wind caught the tattered, skin-stitched sails. The tactical disadvantage was immediate and overwhelming. The Bone Fleet didn't need wind to maneuver. Driven by the rhythmic, telepathic pulse of Malakor's will, the skeletal ships moved with a predatory grace, cutting across the current and the wind, as if the water itself were helping them. It was here that the first great tragedy of the battle occurred, the fall of the Iron Sentry. The Iron Sentry was a massive sea fort situated on a jagged outcropping at the bay's narrowest point. It was supposed to be the anvil upon which the Bone Fleet would be crushed. But as the lead ships of Malakor's armada approached, they didn't fire back. Instead, they performed a maneuver that defied the laws of physics. The ships began to shed their outer layers, releasing thousands of animated skeletal husks into the water. These were the drowned guard, foot soldiers of the necro-tide, who did not need to breathe or swim. They simply walked along the seabed, invisible to the defenders above, and scaled the vertical cliffs of the Iron Sentry. By the time Admiral Valerius realized why the fort's cannons had gone silent, the ramparts were already slick with the blood of his men. The fort's great beacon, which was meant to guide the coalition's reinforcements, flickered and died, replaced by a ghastly, baleful green flame that signaled the bay was now a trap. Amidst this encroaching darkness, a few flickers of hope remained. High Sorceress Alara of the Suncallers recognized that this wasn't a battle of steel, but a battle of spiritual resonance. From the deck of her light frigate, the Dawnstar, she began the counter-liturgy. As the Bone Fleet exhaled a thick, necrotic fog that blinded the coalition's gunners and drained the life from their lungs, Ilara and her circle of mages channeled the raw energy of the rising sun. For a few brief, glorious moments, the bay was pierced by pillars of golden light. Where this light touched the Bone Fleet, the calcified hulls groaned and crumbled, the necrotic enchantment stripped away by the purity of the solar fire. However, Malakor had anticipated the intervention of the Suncallers. It was in this moment of the coalition's desperate counterattack that the betrayal of the Shattered Ore took place. Among the coalition were several mercenary companies, including the infamous Shattered Ore, led by Captain Vane. Vane, a man whose loyalty was always measured in gold, had been visited by an emissary of Malakor weeks before the first sail was spotted. He hadn't been offered gold, but something far more seductive: eternal life and a seat at the right hand of the Lich King. As Alara reached the climax of her spell, Vane's hidden vessels turned their guns not on the undead, but on the Dawnstar. The betrayal was surgical. A single, concentrated volley from the mercenaries shattered the Dawnstar's main mast and disrupted the major circle. The pillar of light flickered and vanished. Ilara was thrown into the churning, blackened water, and with her disappearance, the last shield against the necrotic fog dissolved. The psychological blow was worse than the physical one. Seeing their own allies turn against them in the middle of a literal apocalypse broke the spirit of the coalition's vanguard. But Malakor's true masterpiece was yet to be revealed, as the coalition fleet fell into disarray, drifting aimlessly in the unnatural mist. The water in the center of the bay began to churn with a violent vertical force. This was the awakening of the abyssal heart, an ancient relic buried beneath the sediment of the bay for eons, which Malachor had spent months preparing to raise. The sea didn't just rise, it boiled with a sickly luminescence. From the depths rose a structure that dwarfed even the largest galleon. A cathedral of bone, a floating fortress known as the ossuary. The ossuary served as Malachor's flagship and a mobile conduit for the underworld. From its spires, harvester beams of violet energy shot out, striking both friend and foe alike. But the effect was different depending on the target. When the beams hit the coalition ships, the living crews withered into husks instantly. When they hit the bone fleet, the skeletal ships were infused with a terrifying new vigor, their wooden fragments turning into iron-hard obsidian. Admiral Valerius, now commanding a dying fleet from a burning ship, realized that the battle had transitioned into its most lethal phase. The defenders were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting for the time needed to evacuate the coastal cities behind them. The Battle of the Bay was no longer a naval engagement. It had become a frantic, bloody rear-guard action against a force that grew stronger with every casualty it inflicted. Every sailor who fell overboard didn't drown. They rose moments later, their eyes glowing with that same baleful green light, reaching up to pull their former comrades into the depths. The sheer detail of the carnage was recorded by the few chroniclers who survived on the distant cliffs. They spoke of the sound, a deafening roar that combined the crashing of waves, the thunder of cannons, and the high-pitched, melodic chanting of the necromancers aboard the ossuary. The air itself grew cold enough to crack wood, and the spray from the sea turned into shards of ice that lacerated skin. As we look deeper into the logistics of this nightmare, we see that Malachor wasn't just killing soldiers, he was harvesting a tide of bone. The ultimate goal of the abyssal heart was to create a permanent bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. If the ossuary could maintain its position in the center of the bay for a full lunar cycle, the veil would tear completely, and the bone fleet would no longer be restricted to the water. They would be able to sail through the very air, bringing the end of days to every corner of the continent. But even in this abyss of despair, the seeds of a final, desperate gamble were being sown. While Valerius held the line and the traitors feasted on their hollow promises, a small, unnoticed silhouette was moving through the chaos. A single, unmarked longboat, carrying a cargo that Malachor had overlooked in his arrogance, was rowing toward the pulsating center of the abyssal heart. The heroes of the bay weren't just those with crowns and staves. They were the ones willing to descend into the very maw of the beast to find the one flaw in an immortal's plan. The nightmare was indeed just beginning. But as the first phase of the battle ended, the stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine the meaning of sacrifice. The longboat moved with a spectral silence, its oars muffled by thick wrappings of enchanted kelp, cutting through water that had turned the color of bruised plums. Above them, the sky was no longer a canopy of stars, but a swirling vortex of necrotic energy, a cyclone of souls tethered to the abyssal heart. Every stroke of the oars felt like dragging a blade through cold honey. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the ozone of misfired sorcery. In the distance, the main fleet of the bay, the iron-grip galleons and the swift-sailing windrunners, were locked in a suicidal dance with Malachor's bonewalkers. From this distance, the grand battle looked like a forest fire on the horizon, orange sparks of Greek fire clashing against the sickly green luminescence of necromantic blasts. Malachor stood upon the prow of the ossuary king, his flagship carved from the rib cages of forgotten titans. He did not look at the longboat. His eyes, two burning embers of violet spite, were fixed on the collapsing lines of the mortal navy. To him, the battle was already won. He was a conductor leading a symphony of screams, his skeletal hands twitching in rhythm with every ship that sank into the depths. He believed the bay's only hope lay in their cannons and their prayers, and he had already silenced both. He did not see the three figures in the longboat, a disgraced monk, a mute saboteur from the sunken isles, and a woman whose name had been erased from the archives of the Great Library. They carried no banners, they wore no armor. Between them sat a chest, bound in chains of cold iron, vibrating with a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to push back the oppressive fog. As the longboat drew closer to the abyssal heart, a jagged spire of obsidian and solidified shadow erupting from the epicenter of the bay, the physics of the world began to unravel. Water began to flow upward in thin, spiraling ribbons. Fish, stripped of their flesh but still driven by a cruel animation, jumped from the waves, their needle teeth snapping at the air. The silence here was louder than the roar of the cannons behind them. It was the silence of the void, a vacuum that sought to suck the breath from their lungs. The monk, Brother Hallow, clutched his prayer beads so hard his knuckles turned white. He wasn't praying to the gods of the light. He was chanting the forbidden null verse. It was the only sound capable of shielding their sanity from the heart's psychic pressure. The abyssal heart was not merely a magical construct. It was a tear in the fabric of the underworld, a wound in reality that Malachor had spent centuries festering. It acted as a gravitational well for spirits, pulling the ghosts of the bay's ancestors from their rest to fuel his tireless army. Every soldier who fell in the battle miles away was instantly resurrected, their spirit ripped from the transit to the afterlife and shoved back into their own broken corpses. This was the immortal plan, a closed loop of carnage where death only served to increase the size of Malachor's host. But the flaw that the hero sought was hidden in the very nature of that loop. The heart required a constant equilibrium of agony to maintain its anchor. It was a machine of exquisite cruelty, and like any machine, it could be overwhelmed if fed the wrong kind of fuel. The longboat hit the base of the obsidian spire with a dull thud. Up close, the heart was a cathedral of bone and glass, vibrating with the collective heartbeat of 10,000 stolen souls. The mute saboteur, known only as Kale, stood up, his movements fluid and predatory. He reached for the iron-bound chest. Inside was the echo of the first dawn, a relic not of power, but of absolute purity. A fragment of the world before the first shadow was cast. It was not a weapon that would explode. It was a catalyst that would introduce a single discordant note of grace into Malachor's cacophony of despair. High above, Malachor suddenly paused. The violet fire in his eyes flickered. For the first time in eternity, he felt a prickle of something he had long forgotten: uncertainty. He turned his gaze away from the burning fleet, his skeletal head tilting as he scanned the dark waters near the heart. He saw the longboat. It looked like a speck of dust on a black mirror, utterly insignificant, yet the heart was reacting to it. The obsidian spire began to moan, a sound like grinding tectonic plates. "Insolence," Malachor hissed, his voice a dry rattle of parchment. He raised his staff, a gnarled length of petrified spine, capped with a pulsing soul gem. With a casual flick of his wrist, he summoned the drowned sentinels, monstrous amalgams of shark bone and human sinew that patrolled the deeps surrounding the heart. The water around the longboat began to churn as the leviathans ascended, their eyes glowing with the same baleful light as their masters. The woman in the boat, the one without a name, stepped forward to the bow. She drew a curved blade etched with runes of sacrifice. She didn't look at the approaching monsters or the looming shadow of the ossuary king. She looked at the heart. She knew that to activate the relic, the chest couldn't just be opened. It had to be bathed in the blood of someone who truly understood what was being lost. The Battle of the Bay was no longer a clash of steel and wood. It had devolved, or perhaps ascended, into a ritual of cosmic significance. Back at the main engagement, the human commanders noticed the shift. The undead sailors suddenly became sluggish, their movements desynchronized as Malachor diverted his will to the center of the bay. "Push! For the love of the light, push now!" Admiral Thorne bellowed from the deck of the Vanguard, sensing the momentary lapse in the enemy's iron grip. The mortal ships turned, ignoring the fire and the sinking wrecks, focusing every remaining cannon on the ossuary king. They were the distraction now. They were the shield. They had to keep Malachor's attention divided, even as their hulls were splintered and their men dragged into the freezing dark. Below the heart, the first of the drowned sentinels breached the surface, a nightmare of teeth and rested harpoons. Kale met the beast with a spray of alchemical fire, but for every one he pushed back, 3 more emerged from the depths. Brother Hallow's chant grew louder, his voice cracking under the strain as he held back the literal tide of darkness. The woman raised her blade. She looked at the chest, then at the sky where the violet clouds were beginning to bleed a deep, angry crimson. Malachor realized his mistake. He had prepared for an army. He had prepared for a counterspell. He had not prepared for 3 nobodies and a box of light. He began to chant, a spell of such magnitude that the very ocean began to boil, preparing to incinerate the epicenter of the bay and everyone in it, including his own heart, just to ensure the relic was destroyed. He would rather lose his anchor than his godhood. The air between the ossuary king and the abyssal heart became a tunnel of screaming wind. The woman lowered her blade to her palm. The saboteur fought with the desperation of a man who knew he would not see the sunrise. The monk screamed the final syllable of the null verse. The stage was no longer just set. The curtain had risen on the final act of the nightmare. The confrontation was no longer about who would rule the bay, but whether the bay and the world beyond it would even exist when the light finally met the dark. As the woman's blood hit the iron chains, the chest began to glow with a brightness that threatened to erase the stars. And Malachor's scream of rage was drowned out by the first true sound of hope the bay had heard in 1,000 years. The sound of hope was not a gentle melody or a whispered prayer. It was a roar, a resonance that hummed in the very marrow of those who stood upon the blood-slicked decks of the remaining fleet. The light emanating from the iron-bound chest was a searing, prismatic white, a color that didn't just illuminate the darkness, but seemed to unmake it. Malachor, the tyrant who had built an empire on the bleached remains of his enemies, recoiled. His shadow, once a towering monolith of terror that stretched across the entirety of the bay, began to fray at the edges like scorched parchment. Malachor's scream was a cacophony of 1,000 tormented souls. He lunged toward the woman, his obsidian blade raised to sever the connection. But the air itself had become thick, viscous, with a sudden influx of ancient energy. Every step he took toward the chest felt like walking into a gale of pure sunfire. The woman, her face pale, but her eyes burning with the ancestral fire of a lineage long thought extinct, did not flinch. She was no longer just a sacrifice. She was the conduit. The blood she had shed was the final key to a lock forged before the first bone was ever laid in the foundations of the bay. As the chest's lid groaned under the internal pressure of the light, the nullverse began to react. The sky above the bay, which had been a swirling vortex of nothingness, started to crystallize. Shards of reality, sharp as diamonds, fell from the heavens, piercing the spectral ships of Malakor's bone fleet. The vessels, constructed from the ribs of leviathans and the skulls of forgotten kings, did not merely break, they dissolved. The necromantic sorcery that held them together was being rewritten. The bone turned to ash, and the ash turned to salt, returning to the sea from which it had been stolen. The soldiers on the shore, those few who had resisted the madness of the Bone Lord, watched in awe. As the tide of the battle shifted, not through steel, but through the fundamental restoration of balance. The Chronicles of Bone had always foretold a final reckoning, but the scholars had misinterpreted the text for centuries. They never realized that the king was not a man, but a memory, the memory of a world that existed before death became a currency. Malakor reached the edge of the glow, his skeletal armor glowing red-hot. "You cannot stop the inevitability of the grave," he roared, his voice cracking like dry timber. "The nullverse is the only truth. All things end in the silence." The woman looked at him, and for the first time in a millennium, Malakor felt something he had forgotten: pity. "The silence is not the end, Malakor," she whispered, her voice carrying over the crashing waves and the thunder of collapsing dimensions. With a final deafening crack, the iron chains shattered. The chest burst open, and from within emerged not a weapon, but a weaver, a celestial entity of pure consciousness that had been imprisoned since the dawn of the Bone Era. The weaver did not strike Malakor with a sword. It simply looked at him. And in that gaze, the tyrant of the bay saw every life he had snuffed out, every soul he had bound to his service, and every drop of blood he had spilled to maintain his grip on a throne of decay. The weight of 1,000 years of sin collapsed upon him. Malakor did not die in the traditional sense. He was simply unraveled. His shadow was pulled into the weaver's light, processed and cleansed. The obsidian armor fell to the deck in a pile of harmless soot. The Bone Lord was gone, not with a bang, but with a sigh of relief that echoed through the spirits of those he had enslaved. The nullverse shuddered. The rift in the sky, which had threatened to swallow the world, began to knit itself shut. The prismatic light from the chest surged upward, acting as a needle and thread, stitching the fabric of reality back together. The gray, stagnant waters of the bay churned violently as the corruption was purged. The murky depths cleared, revealing the white sands below, and for the first time in recorded history, the sun began to break through the perpetual bloom of the Bone Coast. As the morning light touched the horizon, the weaver faded, its task complete. The woman fell to her knees, exhausted, her life force spent, but her spirit intact. The chest remained, now empty and dull, a relic of a war that had finally found its conclusion. The survivors stood in silence, looking out at a harbor that was no longer a graveyard, but a gateway. The ships that remained were no longer made of bone, but of wood and iron, their sails catching a wind that smelled of salt and life, instead of rot and stagnant magic. The Battle of the Bay was over. The Chronicles of Bone had reached their final page. But as the survivors began to move, tending to the wounded and clearing the debris of a fallen empire, they realized that the end of one chronicle was merely the prologue to another. The world was scarred, yes. The history of the Bone Lord would haunt their songs for generations. But the bay was free. The nullverse was a nightmare past, and the stars were once again visible in the night sky. The legacy of this day would not be found in the riches recovered from Malakor's vaults, but in the understanding that even in a world built on death, life finds a way to reclaim its throne. The iron chains were broken, the chest was open, and the people of the Bay finally had a future that wasn't written in the dust of the past. And so the legend of the Battle of the Bay draws to its epic conclusion. From the dark depths of the nullverse to the blinding light of the Weaver's return, we have witnessed the fall of a tyrant and the rebirth of a realm. But the chronicles of Bone are vast, and the mysteries of this world are far from fully revealed. What other secrets lie buried beneath the sands of the Bone Coast? What other ancient entities wait in the silence of the void? If you enjoyed this journey through the dark lore and high-stakes battles of this universe, make sure you don't miss what's coming next. The archives are deep, and the stories are just beginning to surface. This is Chronicle Nexus, your ultimate gateway into the worlds of epic fantasy, forgotten legends, and the lore that defines our greatest adventures. We dive deep into the heart of the stories you love, bringing you the details and the drama that other channels leave behind. If you want to support our quest to document every legend from the Nullverse and beyond, there are 3 things you need to do right now. Hit that like button to help our signal reach other lore hunters. Subscribe to Chronicle Nexus to ensure you're part of every new chapter we uncover. And ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of the action. The Battle of the Bay may be over, but the Chronicles are eternal. Share your theories in the comments below. Was Malakor truly defeated, or is a shadow still lingering in the depths? We read every comment and love hearing your take on the lore. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is written by the survivors, but the truth is kept by the Chronicle Nexus. We'll see you in the next chapter. Stay legendary.